Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. We're tracking the unbelievable evolution of James Monroe, a guy who literally reshaped the globe. You know, when we picture the founding fathers, we usually see these fully formed, flawless statesmen, but their actual journeys way more complex. Today, we're looking at a huge transformation. We're going to see how a man deeply tied to the Virginia soil evolved into this absolute powerhouse of global diplomacy. So, here's the big question for us. How exactly does a local Virginia farmer become an international dealmaker who forever changes the map of the world? I mean, that is a massive leap, right? Going from worrying about crop yields to negotiating with European emperors, that requires a serious, real-world education in both politics and human nature. To understand how Monroe pulled this off, we really have to look at the crucible that forged his whole worldview. Take a look at the wounded man on the ground here, just to the left of George Washington. That is an 18-year-old James Monroe. It's the day after Christmas, 1776, the Battle of Trenton, and he's just taken a near-fatal musket ball to the shoulder. Ouch, right? That pain actually stayed with him his entire life. It was a literal, physical reminder of the cost of liberty. And that single traumatic moment, it instilled in young Monroe this radical, lifelong devotion to republicanism and a deep, deep hatred of European monarchy. If you want to understand his entire diplomatic career, it really starts right here on the battlefield. But hey, before he was negotiating global treaties, he was a farmer. After the Revolution, and after studying law under Thomas Jefferson, Monroe actually just wanted a quiet life. In 1793, he bought 1,000 acres in Virginia, right next to Jefferson's Monticello. He called the place Highland, built what he jokingly called his cabin castle, and grew tobacco, corn, and wheat. Now, it's really important to note here that this agrarian lifestyle and all the political ambitions it funded was entirely supported by enslaved labor. By 1810, census records show 49 enslaved adults living and laboring at Highland. They were the ones keeping the plantation running while Monroe started stepping onto the political stage. When you chart his career, the leap is just shocking. Just look at how fast this happens. In 1793, he's managing that Virginia farm. 1 year later, 1794, President Washington appoints him minister to France. And then, less than a decade after that, he's negotiating the Louisiana Purchase. This isn't just climbing the career ladder, it's an absolute masterclass in adapting to extreme pressure. From crop rotations to the bloody, dangerous courts of Europe, literally in the blink of an eye. That first gig in 1794, total trial by fire. Washington intentionally picked Monroe as minister to Paris because Monroe was a known, hardcore fan of the French Revolution. Washington was basically trying to play a balancing act, appeasing the French while handling politics at home. But in doing so, he dropped this young, fiery Republican right into the absolute chaos of revolutionary France, just after the Reign of Terror. And Monroe, he saw the French struggle as the direct sequel to America's own fight for liberty. So, unsurprisingly, this leads to a massive ideological clash. On one hand, you've got Monroe. He is fiercely dedicated to building a global Republican alliance with France to stand up against European kings. He felt his ultimate loyalty was to the Republican cause itself. But on the other hand, you've got his boss, the Washington administration, who are demanding strict, absolute neutrality to protect the fragile new United States. This friction pushes Monroe to take some wild risks, to break the ice with a pretty hostile French government. Monroe goes totally rogue. He directly addresses the French National Convention and enthusiastically calls them a sister republic. He even hands over declarations from Congress, essentially promising American support. It was brilliant, and it absolutely worked to win over the French public, but oh man, it completely infuriated his Federalist bosses back in Washington. They saw it as a massive violation of their neutrality. The final straw, though, was Jay's Treaty. This was a commerce and friendship agreement between the U.S. and Great Britain. Now, remember Monroe's shoulder? He had literally bled fighting the British. He saw them as the ultimate monarchical enemy. So to him, this treaty was an unforgivable betrayal of the French. He was so vocal about his opposition that Washington ended up bitterly recalling him in 1796. Monroe went back to Virginia feeling totally disgraced. But his diplomatic education, far from over. Fast forward to 1803. The political tides have shifted. His old mentor, Thomas Jefferson, is president, and Monroe is sent back to Europe as a special envoy. The mission is simple: buy the port of New Orleans and the Floridas from France so the U.S. can secure the Mississippi River for trade. Jefferson gives him a budget of up to $10 million for this incredibly strategic piece of real estate. So Monroe and Robert Livingston sit down with the French. But Napoleon, who is desperately strapped for cash to fund his wars, doesn't just offer New Orleans. He offers the whole thing. The entire Louisiana territory. We are talking 828,000 square miles. The price tag? $15 million. To put that in perspective, that's barely 4 cents an acre. It's the deal of a lifetime. The only catch? It was way beyond what they were actually authorized to do. Monroe had to make a call, and fast. Jefferson was a strict constitutionalist. He severely doubted the federal government even had the legal power to buy new land. But waiting for a letter to cross the Atlantic would take months, and Napoleon could easily change his mind. Trusting his gut and his diplomatic training, Monroe bypasses his instructions and signs the treaty on April 30th, 1803. With one stroke of a pen, this former Virginia farmer literally doubles the size of the United States. Unbelievable. Now, all of this geopolitical maneuvering culminates 20 years later in 1823. Monroe is now the president of the United States, and he's staring down a massive threat. The Holy Alliance over in Europe, along with Spain, are hinting that they might violently crush the newly independent Republican nations in Latin America to put the kings back in charge. For Monroe, this is the ultimate nightmare. It's the Battle of Trenton all over again, just on a hemispheric scale. So a huge strategic debate breaks out in his cabinet. The British minister, George Canning, offers a joint British-U.S. declaration telling Europe to back off. Even heavyweights like Jefferson and Madison are telling Monroe, take the British offer. But his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, firmly disagrees. Adams pushes for the U.S. to stand completely alone and issue a unilateral declaration without Britain pulling the strings. Monroe takes it all in, synthesizes the advice, and on December 2nd, 1823, he delivers his 7th annual message to Congress. He basically distills his entire life's geopolitical education into 3 core concepts. First, separate spheres of influence for the Americas and Europe. Second, absolute non-colonization in the Western Hemisphere by European powers. And third, non-intervention by Europe in independent American states. Boom. He builds an ideological wall that permanently separates the Republican Americas from monarchical Europe. Now, as an explainer, we have to note there's an ongoing historical debate about who actually authored the Monroe Doctrine. Some historians give primary credit to John Quincy Adams, since he fought for the solo approach and actually drafted the final diplomatic language. But others argue that it was Monroe's lifelong anti-monarchy zeal and his decades in the diplomatic trenches that really willed the policy into existence. Looking at it neutrally, it seems clear that while Adams held the pen, the fiery Republican soul of that doctrine, that belonged entirely to James Monroe. But you have to wonder, what is the personal cost of a life like that? Let's bring Monroe full circle back to the dirt where he started. His lifelong dedication to public service completely ruined him financially. He spent years begging Congress to reimburse him for expenses he racked up overseas. In the end, to cover his massive debts, he had to sell his beloved Highland plantation. And tragically, in 1828, he also sold 17 enslaved people to a cotton plantation in Florida. He died in New York on July 4, 1831, a guy who gave absolutely everything to shape his country, but lost his own home in the process. So, does the Virginia farmer's vision still shape our world today? Just think about it. A modest planter experiences near-fatal trauma on a Revolutionary War battlefield, right? That sparks a lifelong hatred of kings. He then learns the bitter, bare-knuckle realities of global diplomacy, buys half a continent on a whim, and eventually draws the very geopolitical lines that the United States is still enforcing centuries later. It is an absolutely stunning transformation. And it really makes you realize the map we live on today was largely drawn by a man who started out with just 1,000 acres of dirt. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. I hope it gave you a fresh look at how history